I'm now going to go through the frequently made mistakes for assignment 2A. Some of the mistakes that were made were holdovers from assignment 1B, so I reviewed those. Make sure you go back, take a look at my comments, and address those problems before you submit assignment 2B. Let's take a look at some of the mistakes in the first assignment 1C. This is from the simple semaphore class, the acquire method. For some reason, there's a call to signal in acquire. There should be no call to signal at all in acquire. That's unnecessary. Here's the acquire uninterruptedly method. This implementation is incorrect. The spec is not being implemented properly because an interrupt is being caught and the interrupt flag is set, but uninterruptedly is supposed to mean you don't return if an interrupt occurs, and this is returning if an interrupt occurs. Here's a release implementation method from the simple semaphore. Make sure that you optimize the call to notify, so you should always call notify only when the permit count has become greater than 0. This was an implementation, it's a little hard to tell from the code here, but this person had used the grad student implementation to do acquire and acquire uninterruptedly, but then was using the monitor object implementation for the notify and release. So don't make sure, for goodness sakes, that you don't mix the two different forms because it won't work properly. Here's an example of something you should get in the habit of doing. Make sure you always use a try finally block when you unlock reentrant locks so that you make sure that they get released even if exceptions are thrown. Here's a problem that occurs in available permits. Available permits, the mpermits field in available permits method and in the class, the simple semaphore class, is defined as volatile. So there's no need to use a synchronized statement around it. That would defeat the whole purpose. We now move into the Palantir Manager implementation. Here was a set of problems that people keep making. This is, again, left over from the previous assignment. I've talked about this in class a number of times. I showed my solution. Make sure that when you do the loop through the set of Palantir, that you don't use the put method to update it, because that's inefficient. You don't need to use put. You can use a value, a method that comes on the entry object that's returned here from the entry set, which is much more efficient. This is a variant of this same problem, except this time the person's using key set. You should be using entry set. Don't be doing gets and puts. That's much unnecessary code and extra work that really doesn't need to be done. Here's the release method. Make sure that you check whether the Palantir is null, and also make sure that you do that check outside of the synchronized statement, so that you should be making sure that the check for the Palantir is null is outside of synchronized. It doesn't need to be synchronized. Okay, let's now move over to the being async task class. A lot of problems here. People were getting very confused about how to get the colors to change properly on the user interface thread. The key point of all this, and go back and watch the async task interrupted example, is to use the publish progress method. That's how you're going to get stuff from the background thread into the user interface thread. So all these other calls here are confused and incorrect. Similar problem here. It doesn't do any good to make these method calls because they return runnables, so you have to use them in conjunction with publish progress. Here's another problem. I'm not even sure what this does, but it's very confused. This method is going to call do in background, which is a recursive call, so God only knows what's going to happen, but it makes no sense. Here's another problem, the gaze into Palantir. We should be using publish progress here, not other things like execute and so on. So use the publish progress method. The whole point of this assignment is to get experience using the async task methods. Here's some problems with on progress update. I don't understand what this is trying to do, but it's definitely not going to work. It's certainly not going to print the output to the user interface. This possibly will print the output to the user interface, but it's very inefficient and incorrect, and I think it's actually going to execute this in a background thread, so that'll probably be wrong, so don't do that. There's a lot of problems people had with on post execute, so make sure that you read the spec carefully. The comment says you only call shutdown when you're the last being that's gazing, and so this implementation here is always calling it, so that's not correct. Here's an approach that's trying to be conditional in calling shutdown. However, it's using being count as the way to check for this, which makes no sense because that will never equal 0 because it just monotonically increases. Here's another example of some problems. There's a number of things wrong here. First of all, there shouldn't be synchronized this. That's the whole point of using things like decrement and get or get and so on. We don't have to worry about grabbing locks, so that's unnecessary. And then there's a number of problems here. Decrement and get, this should not be called here. That'll make it decrement twice, which is bad. Likewise, you should only call the shutdown method once when you're the last one, the last being that's still running. And make sure that when you do that, you go ahead and pass in a false, never pass true. Some other problems here, I'm not really sure what this code is trying to do, but it's incorrect, and it's calling shutdown every time, which is not correct. This example also has a similar problem. It's calling shutdown every time. You only want to call shutdown, again, when you're the last being that's running. Here's an example where the wrong method is being called. You need to call shutdown, not presenter mview get thread shutdown. So make sure you call the right version of shutdown. Once again, this is calling things every time, which is not correct. It's the wrong semantics. Here are some examples of problems in increment, gazing, count, and check. This one here is calling the wrong parameter, calling shutdown with the wrong parameter, the wrong value. It shouldn't be false. It should be a different value. And for some reason, this code is releasing the Palantir. I have no idea why that's taking place. That doesn't belong in this method at all. Here's an example of a belt and suspenders approach that has too much overhead. There's no need to use synchronized statements around calls to atomic integers. That's the whole point of using an atomic integer. It knows how to synchronize itself, so you don't need to synchronize it with a synchronized statement. Here's another problem. This is not implementing the spec properly. Don't call thread shutdown. You should call the shutdown method, passing in true. Here's decrement gazing. This is also belt and suspenders overkill. You don't need to use synchronized and also do the decrement. Get rid of the synchronized block. Now we're into begin being tasks gazing. There's a number of problems people had here. First of all, think carefully about the size of the thread pool. It's got to match something important, like the being count. Otherwise, strange things will happen. This implementation, for some unknown reason, is allocating between 5 and some billions number of threads, which is incredibly inefficient for one thing, but is not at all what the implementation is supposed to do. Likewise, the keep alive time should be 0, not 60. You don't want this thing to time out. It's meant to be a fixed size thread pool. Here's another problem people made. Some people, by the way, forgot to put in the execution of the async task, so their code isn't going to even run. That was a little concerning because it meant that you didn't actually test your programs. This example, please try to use a Java for each method rather than using a for each loop. And this implementation is forgetting something very important when execute on the executor is called. There's a missing parameter here that you need to take care of. Here are some other problems with begin being tasks gazing. So in this case, the thread pool executor that's being created, for some reason, just passes in the hard-coded value 10. Have no idea why. That's not correct. Don't be passing in anything other than a non-zero value here. And if you set the thread pool as the final parameter, you don't need to set it again here. It's redundant and unnecessary. Let's take a look at thread factory. So here, a number of problems with thread factory. This particular implementation will give every being the same name, which you really don't need to do. I would just leave off the name altogether. It's just fine to use the runnable. This example doesn't make any sense. It's giving the current thread's name as the name of the thread. I'm not sure what the point of that was. Here's an example from iterating through the async tasks. This actually doesn't really belong here. It belongs up here a bit. Let's put it here. So this particular example is not correct because it's not taking advantage of the thread pool at all, and it's passing in the the thread pools are not being taken advantage of, and for some reason this is being cast to a runnable. I'm not exactly sure what the point of that is, but that's wrong. Let's see down here. Let's take a look at await termination of thread pool executor. A lot of people got this wrong. This timeout value here needs to be a very large value, like long max value. Definitely don't put in a 0. That'll time out right away. And even something like 60 seconds is probably too low if you have a lot of iterations and you have a slow machine. Here's an example. This is actually from shutdown. I should move this down here. So there's a couple of different problems people had with shutdown. Let's go ahead and clarify that so it's easier to see what it's doing. So this particular approach is passing the wrong value to cancel. Please also try to use a for each method rather than a for each loop. And in this case, don't be passing abnormal shutdown. Don't be passing the parameter. Be passing true. That's what you want to pass. And make sure that you call the version of shutdown that shuts down the thread pool immediately. The one that's called here is going to defer till all the threads finish running, and you don't want to do that. You want to shut it down now. So those are the basic comments that I had for this assignment. Please also make sure that you do not remove the to-do statements. Several people remove the to-do statements, which makes it much more difficult to figure out how to review the code because I have to hunt for all the places where the code has been changed. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Either post them to Piazza or bring them to class. Thanks.